A compromised or low oxygen carrying capacity of the blood is known as anemia. Anemia comes with a number of different symptoms. Individuals are very tired and weak. Their skin can be pale. It can affect the heartbeat. They can have shortness of breath, chest pain, dizziness, cold hands and feet, and can develop a headache. So what are some causes of anemia? One is a low red blood cell count, a low red blood cell volume, or low hemoglobin content. There's an important measure we use to determine the volume of blood occupied by red blood cells. This test is known as a hematocrit. So what a hematocrit will do is just measure how much of that blood has red blood cells in it. It's actually a very simple procedure. They just centrifuge blood and measure how much volume is occupied by red blood cells. The normal range for females is somewhere between 37 to 47% of blood is red blood cells, on average 42. Males have a slightly higher average, or a slightly higher hematocrit. One reason is testosterone. Testosterone stimulates EPO, which EPO stimulates the production of more red blood cells. Another reason why some women might have low hematocrit is menstruation. Menstruation happens each female reproductive cycle, and it results in the loss of some blood. So hematocrit is a very simple procedure to determine how much red blood cells are in someone's bloodstream. And if that number is low, it could indicate anemia. One form of anemia is called aplastic anemia. This occurs when there is not enough stem cells developing into red blood cells. What could cause this? One is an inherited condition. Two, radiation, medication, certain medications, chemotherapy, or even an infection can reduce the numbers of stem cells developing into red blood cells. Another cause is an inherited condition where there is an improper maturation of red blood cells in the bone marrow. This is called thalassemia. Another cause of anemia is iron deficiencies. This is most common in children and teenagers, and vegans and vegetarians. But you can imagine if we can pinpoint the problem to iron deficiency, we can give iron supplements. Third category are vitamin deficient anemias. One, megaloblastic anemia, is due to the dietary deficiency in B12 or folate. Another one, pernicious anemia, is poor absorption of B12. So B12 you get mostly from your diet. This B12 is found in certain foods like green leafy vegetables, red meat. But you can be getting enough dietary B12 but not absorbing the B12 properly. This is done largely by producing a molecule called intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is produced by your stomach to help absorb B12 from your diet. A couple conditions cause a lack of intrinsic factor and therefore poor absorption of B12. Crohn's disease, weight loss surgeries, particularly those that might reduce the size of the stomach. And then as we age, elderly individuals lack proper production of intrinsic factor and therefore have a hard time absorbing B12. Therefore, B12 supplementation can be done. Now, this is typically not done orally because you can supplement with B12 orally and still have a problem absorbing it. So typically, B12 is given by a shot. A fourth category that causes anemia is a genetic defect in hemoglobin. This is known as sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia we've probably heard of, especially if you've ever learned about genetics. We're going to look closely at what causes sickle cell anemia on the next slide. Finally, problems with the kidney can affect the ability to produce red blood cells. And this largely revolves around the fact that the kidney produces a hormone, erythropoietin, or EPO. If the kidney is failing to produce enough EPO, bone marrow is not stimulated to produce new red blood cells. Luckily, EPO can be given as a supplement. Let's look at sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is an autosomal, recessive, inherited disorder. What that means is the genetic defect is found on a non-sex-linked chromosome. The autosomes are the chromosomes other than X and Y chromosome. In fact, the gene for hemoglobin is found on chromosome 11. So that tells us what autosomal means. Recessive means that to develop full-blown sickle cell anemia, you need two defective genes, one from the mother and one from your father. If you only have one defective gene, we call that a heterozygote or a carrier of the sickle cell trait. The specific point mutation that's found is when there's a single change in the gene. There's a nucleotide that's changed, resulting in a change of the amino acid. When the amino acid is changed, we get this defect. What happens is the red blood cells become stiff and sticky. They can clump and get stuck in blood vessels and block blood flow. So as you can see here, we have some normal red blood cells and some abnormal sickle-shaped red blood cells. Those abnormal sickle-shaped red blood cells can cause blockages in blood flow. This can be very painful, can lead to infections, can cause stroke or organ damage. There's a very interesting reason why certain populations have higher incidences of sickle cell anemia. This is known as the heterozygote advantage. The heterozygote advantage led to an increased incidence in certain populations. The reason has to do with malaria. Malaria is caused by a parasite known as Plasmodium. Plasmodium spends part of its life cycle in red blood cells. And back when malaria was rampant in areas of the world, malaria killed many people. But individuals that were heterozygous for the sickle cell trait, their red blood cells were not quite conducive to Plasmodium. So in essence, Plasmodium could not propagate, could not reproduce in people who were heterozygous. So these heterozygotes had an advantage because they weren't getting malaria as often, and therefore they weren't dying of malaria. They didn't have full-blown sickle cell anemia, so they weren't dying of sickle cell anemia. So it was a huge advantage to be heterozygous. If you had sickle cell anemia, there's a good chance you didn't survive because we didn't have very good treatments. And if you were normal, homozygous, and had the two normal genes, there's a good chance you died of malaria. So that wasn't a good thing. So it was just these heterozygotes that had a huge advantage. These heterozygotes survived, reproduced with one another, and because the heterozygote individuals were reproducing, the defective gene reproduced in these populations. Therefore, these populations to this day still have higher incidences of sickle cell anemia. These people have descendants from Africa, Mediterranean, India, and Middle East. This is where malaria was very problematic, and to this day we have a higher incidence of sickle cell anemia in this area. There's also a condition that's a result of high red blood cell production. This is known as polycythemia. It's not nearly as common as anemia, but it can occur. It can occur during extreme dehydration. It can occur when there's tissue hypoxia at high altitudes, or a high production or administration of EPO. Sometimes we refer to this as blood doping. Blood doping has been found in athletes that abuse EPO. They will inject EPO to stimulate red blood cell production. Higher numbers of red blood cells can deliver larger amounts of oxygen to their muscles. The problem is this also increases the risk of stroke in these individuals. So you'll notice the comparison of blood centrifuged. This would be the normal blood, showing about 45% red blood cells. Here's anemia with a low percentage of red blood cells, and here's high percentage of red blood cells found in someone with polycythemia. There's a specific version called polycythemia vera, where there's an excessive production of the immature red blood cells. And they can find these immature red blood cells circulating in the bloodstream. Quite often, polycythemia results in an increased thickness in the blood called viscosity, high blood pressure, and increased risk of stroke. It's fairly a rare condition, but when it does occur, it's often seen in men over the age of 60. Next video, we're going to start our discussions on leukocytes, or white blood cells.